The term startup is so pervasive it needs no explaining. But what about startup cities, pop-up cities, and network states? In our conversation with Niklas Anzinger, we clarify these terms and discuss the role of governance in advancing innovation, especially in highly regulated fields like biotech. Niklas, an operator turned venture capitalist and community builder, invests in startups focusing on areas like hard tech, biotech, and crypto. He's also a co-initiator of Vitalia, initially a pop-up city with the slogan "Make Death Optional." According to Niklas, advancing science alone is not enough to bring new drugs and treatments to market and extend healthy lifespans. It also requires removing drug testing roadblocks with new governance structures.
So, first of all, thanks for joining our podcast. And of course, as an opening, we want to know a bit more about you, about your background, and how you become interested in venture capital. So can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Sure. So my name is Niklas Anzinger. I'm the founder of Infinita VC and CEO and founder of Vitalia. Right. So I'm originally from Germany. And until I was 26, I was spending time in the world of ideas, did research, academia, management consulting, think tanks, and all of that. Didn't find that practical or impactful. So I went into entrepreneurship and I spent about 5 years in Berlin building startups as an operator, which was a ton of fun. So I did see concrete impact that I could have there. And then I went out to start my own businesses as a founder. And I ultimately found an area that connects both kind of my intellectual interests and my practical skills with what I'm doing now. So 2 years ago, I started Infinita, a VC fund that's based in the first VC fund that's based in a modern charter city in Prospera on the island of Roatan, and investing in companies that in over-regulated industries, such as hard tech, biotech, and med tech, or crypto and finance, that can benefit from sort of innovative legal jurisdictions. And I further went on to double down on biotech specifically with Vitalia, because with biotech, I saw, and specifically longevity, I saw one industry that had a deep need for innovation to do faster and cheaper clinical trials and do medical tourism of advanced therapies faster than what's currently possible in the United States, for example, under the FDA or other existing medical authorities. So Vitalia is now my main focus. It started as a pop-up city. It had more than 500 people that visited it on the island of Roatan. And now we're building a permanent community here, mostly of biotech entrepreneurs and scientists that come here to build companies that make death optional.
Okay, cool. And can you tell a little about more about the startups that you invested in and actually what's the process behind it? How do you decide what to invest in or not to invest? How do you get deal flow, those kind of things?
Sure. So with the fund, I have quite a unique story, right? It's not a big fund, right? So I do typically 100K check sizes, which means I don't have to fight for allocation as a lead investor. But in these industries that I go in, hardware, biotech, and so on, the founders see it as a good or important strategic optionality. Some of them are keen to use the advantages that I can provide. So for example, there's a startup called MiniCircle, a biotech startup that made gene therapy here in the jurisdiction of Prospera. So that's kind of a prime example. But from others, I don't expect to. So I'm a good strategic investor on the cap table for companies. So these companies come to me simply because I built a good reputation in sort of the emerging field of network states and how it relates to longevity, the ideas around the great stagnation, effective accelerationism, or defensive accelerationism by Vitalik Buterin. So I was placing myself in these kinds of debates through my podcasts, through my content. So this is how founders come to me. I also have been working with venture partners. So one was particularly standing out. His name is Eli Dorado, who is an influential scholar in the field and is talking to tons of startups. So he's been recommending me tons of really, really amazing startups. And my criteria for investing are simply, or the most important thing is that they're moonshots, right? So that can create billion-dollar plus companies, right? So I'm only investing in companies where I see that potential in the founder, in the founding team, and in the mission that they go on, right? So, and in their thinking, right? So to me, the founder and the team is much more important than the idea itself. I invest in pre-seed and seed. So most of them are rather a bit more advanced than just the idea stage, right? So that is the most important criteria. I look for things such as hyperfluency, which I find a good criteria. How well are they able to articulate what they're doing? How well do they have a grasp of the relevant facts of the market? How well can they explain the technical details? Right. So that's something that's very important because I'm going into quite technical areas that I, frankly speaking, don't understand that well myself usually. But if someone can sort of step out of the sort of the narrow field where they're able to talk to other experts, for example, on biotech, that's not good for fundraising, right? So you have to be able to explain what you do to a non-technical audience. And if you can't do that, that tells me you're not a good fundraiser. So these kinds of communication skills are therefore especially important in these very technical areas. And then, of course, there's the usual things, such an enormous amount of drive and ambition in a founder.
Very briefly, are those first-time founders largely? And are they scientists? I don't know, what's the proportion? What's the background actually a bit?
Yeah, so I haven't really done a careful count of these things, to be honest. What I see is the typical model is that there's one science co-founder and one sort of business co-founder, but typically that business co-founder also has a background in the science, and they have just spent more time engaging with customers, setting strategy on the business side of things, but they can still very fluently talk to the other founders on the technical side, right? So there is this one amazing company called Exovolar that's producing jetpacks, for example. And they have CEO and CTO, but both of them are technical, right? Both of them can build the prototype and both of them can sell. Like both of them have been able to close multi-million-dollar deals or investor fundraisers. So that is a very good combination.
Yeah, and that's quite
rare.
unique skill set.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. You already mentioned this term like network states, and of course, like you have like startup cities, co-living, network states. So for those of people who perhaps are not familiar with these terms, can you explain a little bit of difference between these terms and like what, or like what is the definition in short?
Yeah, so the network state is a concept or an idea popularized by a book by the same name by Balaji Srinivasan, former CTO of Coinbase and partner at A16Z, a major influencer in crypto and in technology and in Silicon Valley as a whole. All right, so he's a really towering figure in that field. And what he's describing in that book is basically the disruption of governance, of governments, states, and nation states by the internet, right? So we're living at a time where we have really advanced technology, especially digital technology, that can allow us to do things much faster. Yeah, and we can communicate cross borders around the world. We can move our entities to different countries. We can move ourselves to different countries or places where we treated better by governments. And much of the services that we expect from governments can be done digitally, but aren't yet, right? So governments are by far the slowest adopters of innovation or of technology, simply because they basically have a monopoly on their citizens. There is very high cost to switching for people. People usually don't leave and go to other countries, and they usually accept kind of the status quo of where they were born or the existing kind of nation states as kind of God-given, and it will never change. And what Balaji Srinivasan is describing is that that won't go on forever, right? So there is already a increasing movement towards new jurisdictions. There is models such as charter cities, which made Dubai, for example, successful, Shenzhen in China. Now there's an increasing number of startup cities, for example, in Honduras, in many places in Africa. So these are kind of forking from existing nation states to develop their own or novel legal systems. Same when it comes to co-living, right? So you can just sign up with co-living companies and live in different places around the world. There's an increasing number of digital nomads who are more independent from sort of the tax or residency constraints that most people are facing. There's also crypto. So crypto makes it increasingly harder for governments and nation states to do taxation, to get sort of to have to seize assets from people, right? So there is countries such as Ukraine, for example, or Iran, or Nigeria, or Vietnam, or Argentina, or Lebanon, in which governments use money printing and inflation basically to fund their own budgets, right? And on crypto, that will be increasingly less possible because it's decentralized money that's not controlled by governments, right? So all of this together, these technological disruptions will lead to, as biology predicts, to different forms of governance. And that's what he's describing with the network state as possible kinds of governance entities that are detached from geographical borders to some degree, right? So you can basically live in a country that could be materially in different places around the world, or have citizens in different parts of the world that are still under the same culture or under the same laws. So that's kind of the key idea that is very interesting, but in many ways, people think of it as this like very new thing. This is kind of utopian and very like cypherpunk or whatever. But many components of these ideas are already existing, right? So charter cities have existed in one way or another for thousands of years. City-states have existed for thousands of years. Modern charter cities or small jurisdictions are on the rise, so or have been on the rise for the past couple of decades. Countries are also competing for citizens through like tax incentives and incentives to do business, such as Dubai or Estonia or Portugal. So this is all already happening, and what's called polycentric systems of law, where you're not under like one territory and one law, already existing, right? So there is already existing a wide variety of different options, different kinds of federations, kinds of legal exemptions by religion. There is countries that have less territorial sort of overlap and sort of are far away from each other in some way. Think of the United States and Hawaii, for example. So many of these things are nothing that new, and are quite are something that we'll be seeing that can be already seen in many ways.
Yeah, so many examples that you mentioned actually coexist with the local government or local regulations. So do you envision that, for example, if some, I don't know, regulations work better, like in this new model, that also they would be adapted by the local government, or is it more like, okay, we want to be just kind of coexisting with the local regulations and that's it? Or like, do you want to be more autonomous? Like, how do you envision this in the future?
Yeah, I mean, that really depends on the specific case, right? So I think there is that potential, and that's kind of the idea, that these sort of regulatory sandboxes or charter cities that have different regulations are innovators and sort of are developing new standards that can then be adopted by others. Right, so this is not something unusual. So think of Estonia, for example, and their e-residence or e-governance platform. That is increasingly adopted by other nations. Or Dubai's free zone incorporation laws. So that's also something that's adopted by other nations as well, that you can incorporate a company in what's called a free zone. So these things are already, so this is definitely a trend that is happening, that local governments or governments in other parts of the world look at what's working elsewhere and adopt it as well. Another very famous example and enormously impactful example is China, right? So China basically looked at Hong Kong and they were thinking, why does it work? And what they found was that it had to do with laws and governance, and specifically that the Hong Kong had common law and that it had freedom to do business. So they were thinking, okay, let's try out this capitalism thing in a small territory which initially was Shenzhen, a fishing village of 30,000 people. And it led to enormous success. It grew into what's now one of the largest cities and most successful manufacturing hubs in the world. And when they saw this, they were applying the same model, sort of regulatory or legal autonomy or exceptions, not that much on the political side, of course, in many different parts of the country of China. So that really radically transformed China's economy.
But so how does this work practically? Because I mean, governments change and so on, and you want to envision something that is stable across like several decades at least, right? So, and I guess the broader than the question is, what is that collaboration between like an entity like you or people like you who want to contribute to the establishment of those zones, uh, and yeah, with the government? What is that collaboration like?
Can you rephrase the question? So the question is about collaboration between existing governments and like special economic zones, or?
Yeah, I guess my question is about, and more broadly, this comes down maybe to your learnings, because I was listening to one of your kind of interviews, and there it was mentioned that it's quite difficult to establish those economic zones, right? And also then there's political aspect that I mean, governments change. There's like a change of people who are in power.
Yeah.
So
And some governments are there are also some governments unstable, right?
like
So
yeah, Honduras, for example,
yeah.
maybe it's not the most stable. So I guess in this like this against this backdrop, how is it easy or difficult to operate and to create something actually?
Yeah, sure. So that's a very good point. Stability of government. That's what we call the catch-22 in the industry, right? So the place where it would be easiest or most predictable to do like a special economic zone would be Switzerland, right? But Switzerland doesn't need it, right? Switzerland is already wealthy. The places where you need it the most are poor, right? So like Honduras or many African countries, but they're typically poor because of bad governance and of course, and because of legal instability. So that leads to a catch-22. So mind you that successful speculative economic zones are often the symptom of increasing good governance, right? So think, for example, of Panama, think of Costa Rica, and think of Uruguay and the Dominican Republic, all of which have very successful special economic zone programs, which kind of speaks to that they were able to ensure better governance, right? And good special economic zones are the result of that. So maybe other countries, but it doesn't look like that in the beginning, right? In the beginning, these countries look like less stable governments, but they improve over time. So Honduras might have a chance to succeed at that as well, right? So especially if they see what the benefit are more widely recognized, which they increasingly already are. So Prosper, for example, has been generating 150 million in foreign investment out of 600 million for the entire country. So that's a lot. So the special economic zones could really bring enormous transfer of wealth and capital, and in the process create jobs for the countries of Honduras. And that can then also lead to improved governance if the government is recognizing, hey, we need to uphold that stability because we get taxes from it and we can create jobs from it, and that will also be politically popular. So that chance is still there in Honduras. And to say, how can it succeed in the beginning? I think there's really just two ways. One is that you have good political leadership simply, right? So maybe El Salvador and Bukele are the next ones who have a chance to succeed at that, right? That you have some kind of political stability, similar to what Costa Rica has been able to do or Uruguay. And then you'll be successful with these programs. And the other is Honduras might be a bit more of a special case because Honduras for a while had that stability, but that government wasn't popular and it was corrupt. So it was losing that stability, right? So it was voted out. But the architects of the special economic zones in Honduras were thinking of that eventuality that the government will change and it might not like these zones. So they tied the special economic zones to investment protection under international treaties. And these treaties are quite strong. And they're actually also an interesting form of international governance, right? So these could eventually prove to be the main success case for ensuring the stability of these special economic zones, even in countries that lack the political stability. So I think we're very close to proving that these investment protections can survive a government that's hostile to these zones and that is threatening to undo them, right? So this current Honduran government is very likely going to be voted out in 2 years. It's very unpopular. And many people in Honduras are recognizing the previous government was bad too, but this one is even worse. So, and if we can prove that, I think that can also be a successful model for other nations around the world to adopt a similar proposal.
So you mentioned that many of those countries are, yeah, they are poor, and but how does it affect the locals? Is it actually creates inequality that you have like even bigger of a gap because there's like only one zone that is like very rich, and what about the rest of the country? Or do you think that yeah, it closes that gap?
Well, again, look at examples of like China or of Dubai or of Singapore, right? So these zones have the potential to create widespread wealth and reduce inequality on a global level, right? Because, you know, the inequality is greatest between a third world country and a first world country. So it reduces that inequality. It allows people in a third world country to catch up with global development and economic growth and sort of enter the frontier and get much more higher paying jobs, right? So that is kind of the model of the ambition. And what I observe here just very practically on the ground is that jobs and economic growth are very popular with people, right? Same as education opportunities for their children. So we're working local here with plenty of communities on the level of business partners or, you know, sending children to the same school. So that is a very harmonious relationship, right? So the antipathy comes rather from sort of far away political organizations that themselves don't live in that don't have that don't themselves have any material need, right? So they oppose it more for ideological reasons, both from within Honduras in the capital and also from abroad. So many of the ones that are spreading negative news about the projects here are from international NGOs with people that come from Western countries, from Germany, from France, or from the Netherlands, or from Europe, but don't really experience the poverty that many everyday Hondurans are struggling with, that these zones can be a way out of.
So locals, like how do locals look at these projects? Like because you mentioned in other like podcasts or interviews that the many locals used to be involved in those projects as well, right?
Yeah. So Prospera, where I'm based, has created about 1,500 jobs directly or indirectly. And there's 2 other zones in Honduras, one of which is in the most dangerous part of the country and is offering affordable security services and housing to blue-collar workers in Honduras, all of them local, 99% Honduran blue-collar workers that are now able to enjoy safety for their children. So most of the people that live in Ciudad Morazan are single mothers because they come from a region where, you know, fathers either often don't last very long and leave or are killed by gangs or are involved in gangs. So that is just a material and enormous improvement. And another zone, Orquídea, has created even more jobs than Prospera. So because they're in the agriculture sector and just have been able to get productive very, very quick. I don't know how many exactly, but they had enormous labor protests in defense of the zone and against sort of the government overreach. So you can already see that it creates these positive externalities for many locals. Now, of course, if you look at the political climate, that can be a bit more complex, right? So the project has been associated with the previous government, which was unpopular for good reasons because it was corrupt and it was bad, right? So people associate that the zones or have associated the zones with that political party, even though they have no direct knowledge or exposure, right? So most Hondurans in the country don't know what's going on really. So they just know media, and many of which have political reporting. Right now, with the current government, that's now getting even less popular. The mood is actually shifting a bit. So now recent polls in Honduras are actually saying, hey, we're cool with these zones if they generate jobs and employment. Like that's what we really need. We're not getting it from the current government. So maybe they're not so bad after all. But I think you have to distinguish a bit sort of that impact on people that are local and directly benefiting from it versus sort of the macro political climate. But even that is now changing positively.
Yeah, so I guess one thing, yeah, in these like those positive externalities is, yeah, it's a good thing for everyone, for the locals and like governments. I guess I in favor of that. But let's kind of come to the ideas actually that Prosper or like Vitalia, those pop-up thingies want to promote, which conceptually would sound more radical, like kind of low death and so on, like longevity, or I guess it depends how you market this, but like from the very kind of abstract level, this would be more radical. So what is, I guess the question is, what is the reception of those ideas? Yeah, apart from the community who come to Vitalia or Zuzalu, yeah, what's the reception of these kind of things there?
Yeah. So, I mean, my strategy or our strategy with Vitalia is we have a very bold and ambitious mission that might sound quite radical, like make death optional. But when you look underneath and when you spend a bit more time thinking about it, it's actually backed up by very credible claims, right? So there's many very reputed scientists that are involved, like Aubrey de Grey. We had huge conferences with the leading scientists in the field. There's a whole group involved of credible clinicians and experienced medical practitioners, for example, the GARM Clinic, whose head is the former head of the US Olympic Committee, right? So he has a very, very strong track record and has a lot of experience in actual treatments of patients, right? So when you look at what is backing up this claims and this big and ambitious mission, it's actually very reasonable. It's very grounded in science. It's very grounded in or practiced by sort of experienced people. And also it's not at all or in any way unregulated, right? So there's still regulations and safety protocols and things like that around these things. There's a very high amount of transparency that goes into it, and they're following many of the same standards that are also used elsewhere in the world. We're just mostly trying to reduce the bureaucratic bloat that comes with the administration of many of these regulations. And I think for that, Prospera really has a more efficient model by sort of putting the task of regulation on insurance companies instead of legislatures, which can then create the right incentives in the administration of these regulations. So yes, it sounds quite bold and quite radical, but underneath it is actually really reasonable and really grounded in something that people can understand and things that people can already sort of get or consume themselves, right? So the GARM Clinic has several treatments that are widely available. The mini circle treatment, the follistatin gene therapy, is actually also based on science that has been proven in humans and animals for the past 23 years, right? So we're really not, so we really not as radical as it initially seems when you look underneath, right? So we're actually trying to go more with new treatments that are already having a track record, that are just not yet entering the market for reasons of bureaucratic lag, right? But we're actually, that's kind of one of the 5 rules that I gave people that are entering Vitalia, actually focus on low-hanging fruit innovations, like things that are already very well proven, but that you could do faster here because they're lagging elsewhere.
But so practically, how does this look? How does Prospera like remove those barriers?
Mm-hmm. So it's basically through a legal innovation, right? So the way things work right now is that rules for doing business are created by legislatures, right? Legislatures are basically by elected politicians or by career politicians who sit in administrative agencies, right? So most people don't know that it's a relatively new system that started mostly in the 1930s in the United States, and it has never been planned to grow that big. Actually, until the 1970s, Washington, D.C. basically had no lobbying, or big companies basically had no lobbying budget, right? So the way the things are right now isn't the way it's always been. It's not natural, and it could be different. And what Prospera wants to do different, it wants to go back to a standard that comes more from the common law tradition. So most people don't know that distinction. I certainly didn't know it, but it's a distinction between common law and civil law. So civil law goes back to the Roman Empire, to the Napoleonic Code, which is more what we see nowadays, which we imagine is top-down government, basically. So you have like a Congress or legislature that makes laws, and then other people have to follow these laws. And all they can do is elect the people that make these proposals, something that you typically don't have a lot of influence over. Common law is a bottom-up approach, right? So common law is often called judge-made law, but it's actually more like case law, right? So it's taking decisions that judges made about real cases in the past, and it enters kind of a common law code, basically precedents that then future judges or decision makers or courts or arbitrators use to adjudicate disputes in commercial matters, right? So you don't need like a detailed regulation on how to regulate AI, for example, or crypto. Instead, you look at widely shared principles. For example, we don't want fraud, right? Or when harm is done, who's liable for it? So common law is very good at clarifying these questions of things that materially happened and adjudicating them, right? So it's more an approach to law that is looking at concrete harms done after the fact instead of prescriptive regulation. Like you need to do these things to ensure no bad things happen, which can be just a bit detached from the real world, right? Because technology is developing so fast, that means that any prescriptive regulation is very quickly outdated, right? But that's a problem because there is no strong process in the civil law process to update existing regulations, right? We're still in crypto, for example, living with securities regulation from the 1930s. They've been updated a few times since, but not very strongly, and definitely not in tune with what would be needed sort of for modern digital assets and for crypto, right? So Prospera is basically creating a new legal system that's based on the common law logic with one key innovation, right? So when it comes to doing business, it recognizes that some industries have the potential for hazard or for harm to unconsenting third parties. This is what they call regulated industries. There can be a regulated and unregulated industry where that harm is very unlikely, like software, for example. But in regulated industry, for example, in medical or in finance, you have mandatory liability insurance. That means you have an insurance that you have to pay, and when you do harm, then that insurance has to pay. Now, that insurance will want you to be regulated, right? Because they want you to follow a certain protocol so they can assess how responsible you are, right? And they would want the assurance, right? If you didn't follow their protocol, they wouldn't have to pay, right? And the insurance then has the right incentives, right? Because they don't want to overregulate you, because otherwise they wouldn't do a lot of business. But they also don't want to underregulate you, because otherwise they have to pay. And I think that is a very excellent idea that could really solve many of the problems that we see in modern regulation when it comes to technology, right? So modern regulation, for example, has basically banned nuclear power, or has banned commercial drone flight, or it actually has banned faster transatlantic flights, right? It has basically capped the speed limits. So even though we have better airplanes now, supersonic flight, we're not able to use them because there's a speed limit that's mandated by regulation. And with this different system, we can remove that, right? So we can ensure that our that regulations, business regulations especially, are more attuned or fine-tuned with the times and with modern technology. So I think that's an excellent idea, and Real Prospera is really the first one to sort of pioneer this new approach.
So what are your thoughts on AI regulation? Because you kind of mentioned, software doesn't do harm, but many people argue about even existential risks related to AI, right? So it's also something that you kind of want to prevent from happening if it ever happens. What do you think?
Yeah.
What do you think?
What's your view? I mean, you do more work on AI than I do, probably. So what is it that you're coming from?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I feel that there is like a spectrum, you know, people who are really, really worried about existential risks, and then they are very much inclined to have all sorts of regulations. And then there's another group of people who say like, let's just see what happens, right? The technology is evolving. We are not yet to know like how it's going to look like. So what are we going to regulate? Even if you have some regulations in place, are we going to even like kind of predict how the technology would look like? So I don't know, I'm perhaps like kind of in the middle of this, but yeah, I can see like,
Yeah.
two sides.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that part. One thing that I would mention is in that debate, even if you agree that AI could pose existential risks, which the possibility of which is definitely not zero, right? That possibility is definitely there. Then the current approach to regulation is making it more risky that these existential risks are materializing. Why? Because it centralizes the power of decision making over these technologies with political entities. And political entities are the ones that have historically done the most damage, right? So the vast majority of like political murders of both your own population and wars of another nation have been committed by central political entities or governments of nation states, right? So these are the most dangerous entities to hold the power of decision making over powerful technology. Witness also nuclear weapons, for example, right? So the risk of that is less so the technology itself, but really, but the risk is who holds them, right? So, you know, someone with a red button who's not in their right mind, you know, that which happens, you know, leaders of some developed countries are like that or potentially unpredictable, opposed to material risk. That is where the existential risk is coming from. So if you care about existential risks from artificial intelligence, don't let governments regulate it. Right? So I can't exactly say what the alternative is or how, right? Because you know, I think the approach is more or is better generally in decentralizing artificial intelligence technology development. Why? Because we've seen in software that that's simply been successful at closing security gaps or holes, right? So if the full software stack or code is controlled by few entities, that is actually making things less safe, right? Because many of these entities have the access to this code on like servers that are physically in buildings that like any janitor with a USB stick could get. Whereas where it's dispersed and more people have access to the code, it's actually much easier for a larger number of people around the world to build better security protocols around them. Now, of course, I don't have the best answer in the world. Of course, you don't want the ability to build like a nuclear bomb in your garage for a large number of people. Of course, you don't want that. But I'm not sure how you would prevent against that. So the solution of like centralized governments to control it also comes with its own risk, right? So I would rather sort of place my bet on the possibility or on the ingenuity of people and the approach of open source technology that people are on average better able to create safeguards and rails rather than sort of dangerous technologies. That is something, I think, a process that I would feel comfortable trusting in as opposed to the alternatives.
Yeah, and you cannot ensure that all governments would have the same regulations, right? And some governments are much slower than others. We can see like COVID example, right? It's what it was worldwide, but many governments, yeah, they made different decisions, right? And then it drastically affected, yeah, people living there.
I
Sure.
wanna switch gears a bit, like from technology and regulation to kind of social technology in a way, and come back a bit to Zuzalu and those things. Actually, yeah, in a way, it is a social technology because it is about community building and communities and how people kind of come together, how they coalesce, and so on. So I believe you attended Zuzalu. What learnings did you take from that actually, or if you like saw some of the organizations taking place, actually what the key learnings that you take from that, and also how do you accelerate the things like Zuzalu in the future?
Yeah. So I think Zuzalu was a major social innovation, as you said. And I think the innovation is that through online, right, through a level of alignment in an online community like the Ethereum community around Vitalik Buterin, if you would bring these people together in the physical world, the level of sort of in-person cross-pollination of ideas is at a level or density that exceeds it's San Francisco, right? And that's an enormous insight, right? So historically, you needed large places like San Francisco or New York to find a large enough number of very smart and very aligned people when you are sort of naturally intellectually curious about technology, and especially in like very specific areas, maybe very specific AI or crypto or whatever, you just needed that large pool. But Zuzalu proved that even with 100 or 150 people that before had interactions online because they're so interested about many of these frontier technologies, could live together in the real world. And it would feel like living in a city with the kind of intellectual stimulation, with a level of intellectual stimulation that's higher than what you could get in existing cities. So that, I think, awakened a tremendous appetite for more of these pop-up cities, which is why we did Vitalia, which is why we have Edge City this year, or Zoo Village, Georgia, the Moo in Buenos Aires, and several other projects that aim to recreate sort of that same level of alignment in physical space. I think what makes Vitalia different from Zuzalu and the other projects is that we deliberately chose a place, or we chose it as a seeding strategy to build a permanent community here. So we're not just here on Roatan for 2 or 3 months. We're now aiming to build an actual city district around it and aim to attract people that want to stay here long term and that want to build companies here.
So those people who want to stay permanently, so what about like their visas or like the residency? Like, are we talking about certain passports kind of like that people come only from certain places, or is it like anyone can come and like there are some, I don't know, agreements in place?
Yeah. So it's not terribly hard to immigrate to Honduras, right? So there is I'm a Honduran resident. So it's just a process you go through that, you have a lawyer that helps you. It's not that expensive. And you basically need to show that you have income from abroad. So that's not terribly hard. And once you're a Honduran resident, you can also be a Prosper resident and enjoy the tax advantages there. Or most of all, there's tax havens. Prosper is not one of them. You do pay taxes, but it's also just very streamlined. So you have like one platform through which it's enormously easy. It takes you 1 or 2 minutes to pay your taxes. So that is, I think, are very good conditions. And so I think these pop-up cities are increasingly realizing the potential of that and are therefore choosing locations with the potential for sort of a long-term or permanence, right? So for example, Edge City is a project by some of the former Zuzalu organizers, Janine and Gary, whom I both think very highly of. And they chose a project called Esmeralda by a major charter city influencer named Devon Zugel. And that's actually a planned or a future potential charter city in Northern California, right? So Devon was specifically looking to attract people that want to live there continuously in the future. Similar, I think Zoo Village, Georgia is tapping into a good location because Georgia the country is very friendly for digital nomads. It has very easy and low taxes for digital nomads, and it has several benefits in terms of residency. So I think that is a good and welcoming trend that the pop-up city movement is going towards.
But more generally, how do you make participants of pop-up cities become kind of residents, right, of those economic zones? Or what is attractive to people?
Well, what attracts them, I think, is there's a uniqueness factor, right, that would attract people, right? So Vitalia is the right place if you're in biotech or longevity, right? Just because of the advantages of the location of Prospera, the legal system, and sort of the ability to do clinical trials faster. So if you really want to build a great biotech company or startup, Vitalia is the right place for you to do that, right? So I think Georgia will be more branded as sort of privacy technology and crypto, especially for people from Eastern European countries that are sort of threatened by authoritarian governments or regimes, right? So I think each of those projects will have some kind of uniqueness factor about them that makes them attractive for an early cohort of people to join. So in technology development, we speak of something like the technology adopter curve, right? So in the beginning, you don't want to compete with the mainstream. So that we're not competing with like the average person that would choose to live in San Francisco or New York. We're looking just for someone in the beginning, like the innovators that are highly attracted to one major advantage that we can bring. So they forget or sort of it's less important for them to have all the other amenities of San Francisco and New York, but they come for that thing that's uniquely valuable to them. And then over time, you sort of make the place or make the technology more attractive for what's then called sort of an early majority or a late majority or the laggards, right? So this way you build a bigger movement.
So now we mostly, of course, talk about digital technologies, and I imagine that people think more like about software. But where does longevity idea come from? Like, how is it connected to all these new cities and these innovations?
Yeah. So longevity, by longevity, I think the more precise term for what we're doing at Vitalia is radical life extension. The other association that longevity has is healthy or lifestyle longevity, right? So that means, diet, exercise, and sleep and working out to live a bit longer and healthier, which is great. You should do that, right? So you have a better life. But most of your final age is determined very strongly by genetic factors, right? So even if you do everything right, maybe you live 5, maybe maximum 10 years longer, but you live healthier, so you should do it, right? But radical life extension is the idea that we could fundamentally sort of intervene in human biology in ways that could make us live much longer. Maybe 100, add 10 years, and maybe at some point we could add hundreds of years or maybe even 1,000 years. So that's why the idea of make death optional. And that's not far-fetched, right? So Nobel Prizes have been won for insights that lead us on the way of how to do it by Shinya Yamanaka, for example. Aubrey de Grey held his famous TED Talk in 2006 that was speaking about sort of the hallmarks of aging and how we can really intervene at the fundamental cellular level into human biology. To do that, we're living at a time of enormous and exponential growth in our understanding of genomics, right? And genes as the language of human life, or of life in general for that matter. So we're living at a time, especially with breakthroughs in AI and in software and in computing, where we can run models on larger amounts of data, which is necessary to really solve some of these fundamental challenges, that we can make enormous progress. So witness, for example, the COVID vaccines. Moderna has produced the first vaccine in the course of one weekend in January 2020, before the pandemic even started, which was actually for me the triggering moment. We have this technology that's allowing us to do things that are indistinguishable from magic in such a short amount of time. But then it's really the human institutions that have been built, like, that are 50 or hundreds of years old, that are not keeping up to date, right? And that matters, right? Because millions of people might lose their lives as a result from these institutions just lagging and adapting to this new technology, right? So that's sort of the backdrop of the idea of longevity or radical life extension, that we could do what is biologically certainly a possibility, right? So there are some animals like the Greenland whale or the naked mole rat that basically don't age in the same way as humans do, right? And if we prevent aging, right, so we prevent most diseases that come from aging, right? So cancer, Alzheimer, ALS, these are all diseases that rapidly increase with age. And correspondingly as a result of age, most likely, right? So aging is kind of the cause for these diseases and kind of the cellular degeneration or processes in the human body that can be described as aging, right? So longevity as a field or radical life extension really wants to tackle the root cause of all diseases, which is aging itself. And there are promising pathways to do that. However, the field is very young. Or the field is very much in its infancy, right? So if anyone is out there promising you live 20 years longer with this thing, that's not true, right? So we don't have treatments right now that are that well proven, right? So there seems to be one that's standing out with this rapamycin, which has very good evidence that it can increase lifespan, but there's not much else beyond that, not even in mouse studies, right? So there's been this very long thread just recently on Twitter by a very well-known scientist from a company called Zero that has said, hey, we're not as far as some people claim, not even in mouse studies, right? So we really need to give this field a very big push, right? So aging research, neuroscience, longevity research is not getting a lot of funding. So there's this perception that it's like billionaires who want to live forever, which couldn't be further from the truth. Because if that was the case, the field would have much more funding, which it doesn't have. Right. So right now it doesn't get mainstream science funding, right? Because the science funding institutions are very centralized and the FDA is not recognizing aging as a disease. So we really could need more than 10, more than 100 times in funding of basic science and research. That plus the ability to commercialize more rapidly and build companies around some of these novel scientific insights that could increase our lifespan, which is again why Vitalia exists, right? Because we think the main barrier that we need to solve for is the institutional barriers. But of course, others would point out that there's enormous barriers in our understanding of the science, right? So the science also needs to make a lot of progress if we want to deliver on that dream of making death optional.
Indeed, since you mentioned science, I wanted to ask actually how the ideas around decentralization, Web3, and those kind of things, how can they advance science or like help mobilize capital and so on? On the other hand, writing code, analyzing large volumes of data is not the same as working in the lab doing like some work with live tissue and so on. So actually, I don't even know how some research labs would work in a kind of prosperous type of environment, right? So practically, but overall, how do you think actually decentralization can advance science?
Yeah. So I think one important thing to notice is how decentralized science already is, right? And that's good, right? Because the science that advances the most rapidly is always the one where its scientists are the most collaborative and where data and insights are the most widely shared, right? So it is my understanding, although I'm not from the field, that neuroscience and genetics rapidly advance as a result of there being loads of available public data and much of the code and of the data being shared open source instead of putting into patents or into IP or into sort of expensive paywalls of scientific magazines and things like that. So that is the good part. That's why decentralization works for science. It works if there is low barriers to entry, right? So if, and the things that prevent it are things like IP laws, for example, or patents. So these are the things that I think would lead to or are leading to more centralization or stagnation in science. So that's why I think ideas or movements that are making sort of underfunded areas of science, such as longevity, more accessible, like a Vitalia, or finding novel ways to make IP more widely accessible through IP NFTs are very, very promising and very needed. But the important thing to notice is that science is already very decentralized. And I think that's actually the core value of it that makes it so productive.
Yes. I think what you're mentioning about open science, that's true. Especially if we are talking about neuroscience or also AI, because we have like lots of available data, right? Like natural language and image processing. But talking about biomedical science, so if we think about some medical trials, how do we scale, right? Because is it only like medical tourism that people only come and get these interventions? Because I mean, yeah, medical domain is highly regulated in every country. So like, how do you make sure, or who is responsible if things go wrong, right? Or how do you can, yeah, let's say you do like a medical trial, but some things can go wrong.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to say on that topic, and ultimately, I think there will be changes happening in the world that we can't yet anticipate and how they look, right? So I think the best thing we can, but we know that things won't go on forever like that, right? Because the costs for healthcare in the United States are continuing to increase despite falling life expectancy. Right. And at this rate, if it continues, it will eat up the federal budget to unsustainable amounts that no amount of debt or money printing can get the United States out of. So changes will happen. Either if they come deliberately and if, politicians and legislators implement changes before it's too late, or if, things go downhill and then things will be a bit more chaotic and then changing in the process, that's a different question. But I'm quite certain that changes will happen. And then the question is, and I think the best that we can do here in Prospero with Vitalia is build a system that can be done elsewhere as well. Right. So the goal of what we're doing here is not that it will be forever stuck here or can only be done to medical tourism. Instead, I think about it more as a protocol. Right. So, and the protocol right now under the FDA is that you have to go through these 4 stages of trials before you go to the market, and because it's centrally administered in one bureaucracy, it takes 10 to 15 years and costs hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, right? Which is in no way inevitable. So my alternative protocol is to unbundle the process. So first off, unbundle safety and efficacy trials. Like if we can implement that one change in the FDA in the United States, that would solve like 80% of the problem. So don't make efficacy trials something that's centrally administered by one organization, by the FDA. I would give that completely away. Just let the market do efficacy trials. And that is absolutely not a crazy proposal. That is something that, in fact, you can already see evidence works if you look at off-label drugs. Right, so off-label drugs have been proven for safety and efficacy for one use, but they're used off-label for a different use, right? So that means that these drugs haven't been proven effective for what they're used for what they're prescribed for by doctors or agreed on by competent medical practitioners, usually, that they can be used for. Right, so there are decentralized ways to figure out efficacy without going through one centralized bureaucracy. And in fact, I think we would have better efficacy data if we allowed that, if we unbundled that, simply because this would make it more economical to do trials on these off-label drugs, right? Right now, it's simply not economical. It's too expensive. So especially for many generic drugs, drugs that are not patentable, or drugs that just have a small incidence or group of users that would be affected by it, you wouldn't go through centralized FDA trials because you couldn't recoup those costs. Right? If you unbundle it, if you make efficacy trials something that more than one market participant could undertake, that would lead to an explosion of innovation and variety of different trials. Right, so you can get sort of more through biomarkers, self-administered or decentralized trials, or collect real-world data. So there's all sorts of ways in which things would go better. So if it was really just that one change of a magic wand, advocate for one change in the United States and the FDA, it would be that, just to give up efficacy trials. And then the market innovation would take care of the rest. Now, safety trials are, of course, important, right? So you do want safety data also from mice or from animal studies and from humans, right? So I think it would generally be good that every drug, or I think that people generally wouldn't take drugs that have not been tested on anyone, right? And you could innovate, I think, even in that process. But in that process, there's less innovation needed, right? So the safety protocols that are used right now by the FDA and the WHO, they're fine, right? So I think they're a good thing to use. When it comes to animal studies, these are also good. There's certainly some innovation we can do, but it's not like fundamentally broken, right? So problem is really just the bureaucratic administration thereof, right? So that's something where we can cut a lot of costs. But I think the key innovation would really be on efficacy trials. And I think that's, again, something that's simply an argument that others will be or are already able to see, right? There's been numerous studies around that, for example, on the off-label trials. Also, the reason that efficacy trials exist was in 1962, right? So, and they were trying to actually solve problems of safety, not of efficacy. So I think the kind of new standards that we're developing here, especially if we're able to prove that we can bring hundreds of drugs to the market successfully that are safe and effective, I think will be a good reason for other jurisdictions to rethink their approach.
So perhaps as a last question, going into the future, how do you measure the success of your efforts, and what do you actually want to achieve? I don't know, in the time frame of 2 years, 4 years, 5 years.
Sure. So the ultimate goal is that we bring thousands of new drugs and treatments to market that save people's lives in measurable ways, meaning extending their healthy lifespan by billions of years, right? So which is what successful drugs and treatments do, right? So if we're able to solve aging, solve cancer, and solve many of the individual diseases, that will just do that. So that's the most important and key metric, to bring these new treatments and drugs to market to as many people as possible. And they're safe and effective, meaning they do what they're supposed to do, meaning extend and save people's lives. And in the meantime, of course, there's a couple of intermediary steps. So I want to build a thriving community here on Roatan, right? So by the end of the year, we want to have 200 what we call semi-permanent residents. So people that live here with us, that have sort of residential space that we share, and we have sort of common areas and sort of resources for startups to accelerate, including labs, including medical infrastructure and hospitals. And by the end of next year, I'd like that to be more like 1,000 semi-permanent residents. So I think at that point, we can credibly claim that we can be a major biotech hub in the world. Right. And then that ultimately leads to that Camden explosion of new drugs and treatments.
Thank you, Niklas, for this great conversation. And we really wish you good luck with your projects. And we hope you are going to achieve what you dream of. So, because the idea is great, and I think it's very innovative. And we are looking forward to talk to you after 5 years and see how the progress is going.
For sure. And for any of your listeners or yourself, if you want to visit, you can do so anytime, right? So the island of Roatan is abundantly safe. Honduras has a bad brand, but Roatan can be reached by direct flights. Only 3 US states are safer. It has existing infrastructure. It has a very friendly population, most of which is English speaking, right? Because it used to be a British colony. There's direct flights of 2 hours from Miami and from Houston. And the place here is very beautiful, and you can just join or enter as a Vitalia resident and go to one of our events as an introduction to what's happening here.
Yeah. So do you have any upcoming events that you would like to mention?
Yeah, so on April 26 to 28, we do a conference called Safe Harbor. That's about law and legal engineering for a bio-crypto future, right? Because we're developing kind of new laws and regulations for these new technologies, as I was mentioning in this conversation. In May 24 to 26, we have a conference called BioContech or Construction Tech, which is where we debate or discuss or bring builders, architects, and visionaries that build physical infrastructures, both sort of residential and commercial space for an emerging biotech hub. Then in June 20 to 22, we're going to do a partnership with the Garm Clinic and Pristine Regenerative Nexus, a group of very reputed clinicians and doctors who are setting up clinical space and medical infrastructure here. And we're going to talk about regenerative medicine, right, as an industry. And then in July, we have a summit, probably for the whole month, a summit around sort of July 18 to 22 around human augmentation, right? So that's really the sci-fi stuff. So cybernetic implants, for example, into the human body, together with a group that does that professionally, right? So also something that is very exciting.
Yeah, indeed, it's very exciting.
Lots of events. How do people actually not keep in touch, but stay kind of up to date to all the things that are happening there?
Yeah, sure. So the easiest way is just to go to vitalia.city. Right, so vitalia.city in your web browser, and you see a link on the top right where you see different connection points, including a newsletter, including engaging with us on Twitter, or see our content on YouTube, our events, and where you can apply to be a Vitalia resident.
Cool. Totally recommend it. And again, thanks so much, Niklas. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for having me on, Julia and Judita.